How will the 34 counts affect the 50 states in this 2024 election prediction? Let's get right into it. So first and foremost, you can see how the map is already mostly filled out. Obviously, the conviction has no bearing on the vast majority of the states, but we do have about 10 that do have some say in this matter. Now, of course, this is not a done deal. We can see that both electorates are pretty even, as you can see, 219 to 211, but we're going to narrow this down going forward. As y'all can see, we do have a pretty even electoral matchup as of the most recent polls. Again, this is not fully encapsulating the fervor that is felt on one side and the disdain on the other for the verdict of this outcome and what it affects therein in the nominees' prospects, that being Donald Trump in this case. But we do have one really early on poll the day after of this whole thing happening in the first place. And we can see this is a Harvard X overnight poll. Now, this is a very niche scenario, but we do have a PDF to really read into. And even beyond this, we have some extra factors. Of course, you've got a reminder to get yourself a Grandma McFlurry. I'm not personally, but we do have some things to read here. And the Daily Mail reports that Donald Trump's campaign has raised over $200 million since his guilty felony verdict. So think about that. So it's claimed that he's made $200 million. Why is this important? Some people may say, well, you know what? That sort of money is a real big game changer when you look at it one way. So again, the polls are not accounting for this yet because there's a delay with all this logistical nonsense. That being said, though, I can surmise using my expertise on this topic. And right now we can refer to 8 years ago, Clinton outraising Trump by 3-1 in a dash for cash. Okay, so you can see that as of this time 8 years ago, Clinton was beating Trump nominally in fundraising by 3-1. Now, Trump went out to win that race, but you can see how even being outspent, Trump is still winning. So let's look at the other election. We move on to 2020, and you can notice immediately that the spending goes up at the presidential level from $2.4 billion. It goes all the way to 5.7. So it basically doubles election over election cycle, which is nuts because if you can look at 2008, 12, and 16, they're all in line with each other. But again, polarized circumstances, dire circumstances like this election and the ones prior to with Donald Trump involved, all of a sudden bring more attention to the race. If we look at the update as of a couple years ago, you see that in 2020, Trump's campaign raised about $775 million, whereas the Biden campaign raised over $1 billion in that circumstance. So right here, we can see that Biden's campaign became the first to raise over $1 billion. And so you can see that he was outspent in that race and narrowly lost in the Electoral College. Again, it was about 46,000 votes that separated Biden versus Trump in that ultimate outcome 4 years ago. Now, a more recent update on the funding, because again, this huge money bomb of about $200 million in the past weekend is really incredible when you put it into scale. If we look at January 2023 to December and basically New Year's of this year, 2024, you'll notice that the cash on hand is a little different between the two parties. In fact, it's about a 40% difference. You can see $87 million, I would say, in total on the Republican side. And when you look at the tabulation of the liberal side, it's 126. So that's, again, about a 40% difference, maybe 30. The point being is that the Democrats did have more money at that point. But by all indications, of course, we know that the recent tides have been changing in the fundraising race. So we know for about 8 years, the Democrats have been outspending Republicans, namely Trump versus Biden or versus Hillary Clinton. The thing is, though, is that right now, Donald Trump is actually outraising Joe Biden. And in fact, when you look at his most recent interview with Fox and Friends in the morning, I believe, he said that he had been to 2 fundraisers and a UFC event in the same day. So you can see how his priority is more so towards fundraising off of the fact that he got indicted over these things and convicted even. And you can see how that's even changing things because the Democrats have been averaging about $50-ish million in fundraising. And in fact, in April, I think, over $70 million were raised for the Trump campaign prior to this conviction, and then about another $200 million in the span of about 70 hours. And so you can see how the numbers are changing. Now, Trump beat Hillary, being outspent by 3-1, evidently, in 2016. And then when he was outspent by Biden, he also got extremely close and outperformed expectations and the polls, as we all know from back then. And then now he's actually having more money as of right now. And that trend line seems to be pretty valid going forward. And so you can see how things are really changing. One can say there's true satisfaction in looking in opposition polling because you can see how even the slanted pollsters even predict a Trump victory. And I can make a mountain out of a molehill with this factoid, okay? So we have CBS News polls on the day of the indictment, or of the conviction, sorry. 56% of people polled said that it was a fair trial versus 44% said it was an unfair trial. The reason why this is important to bring up is because it might seem like I'm proving the other side's point, but it really isn't even the case. And pertinent to that, of course, is that the Republican Party Usually, and this is just generally in politics, most people can agree on a trials process. So, like if you were to take, your average American person, or even a group of them of different stripes, and you were to say, okay, there's about 10 different convictions about different drug cases or whatever have you, randomness, they would agree about 90 something percent of the time that justice was served to some extent. So to only have a 56% approval rating on this conviction is to say that, of course, it's a really bad look for democracy. In fact, it's a bad look for the incumbent president, Joe Biden, and the Democratic Party writ large. It makes Trump into a martyr, despite not even the majority of people saying it was an unfair trial. According to this liberal pollster, it's still indicative, of course, of a bigger phenomena, which is that the distrust of the government and the branches therein, like the judicial one, of course, is crumbling in public approval overall. Also, by the way, according to the very nebulous standards of this conviction, it is somewhat obvious to a lot of different Republicans that, of course, Donald Trump might have technically broken the law in a very generous, charitable interpretation of it, but they still think that it's a rigged circumstance, so to speak, and I think that's a fair thing to say. And I think that's indicative of how the winds are changing and the Overton window is shifting towards the right because it's inherent. It's a populist uprising in mentality. It's where people say, you know what, this guy's literally guilty of a crime according to a jury of his peers. And I still doubt the validity of it because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to the fact that the things were really slanted and the process that it was really, undertaken. And so it's like really nasty to think about. This is my first time reading it, so you're going to get the most raw reaction. But when you look at the question saying, did Donald Trump get a fair trial? Fair trial, 96% of Democrats say it was a fair trial. Well, no duh. About half of independents also agree, and about 14% of Republicans think so, whereas unfair trial, a little bit of Democrats say so, about half of independents, and a vast majority of Republicans say so. So that's more or less in line with the poll you just saw a minute ago. Now, here is the copium, okay? I got you the extended release perk. Look, here it is. While most independents, according to this liberally slanted poll, by the way, that's the important caveat here in the asterisk, the reason why I think this is a good sign for Donald Trump and his 24 election prospect, of course, is having to do with the fact that if you were convicted on anything in any random sample, would half the country actually agree that it was a rigged process? Huh? Think about that way, okay? You get the average guy stung for DUI on felony, okay? What percent of independent voters would say that was a fair or unfair trial? The vast majority would say it's fair, obviously. And so for even 46% to be discontent with that result shows that the thing in and of itself is an unpopular move and destroys and basically eviscerates the credibility of the incumbent government. Also, keep in mind this, okay? Let's take it out of your shoes, get out of your shoes and become an alien and just hyperanalyze the macro scale of this, okay? You look at America where we're obviously looking for justice in every particular case, where we want 99% of cases to go without a hitch, where the jury's decision actually is the right verdict. But what is the poll result? Again, liberally predisposed. 57% say that the Trump conviction was a right verdict, whereas the incorrect verdict was selected about by 43% of these respondents on that same day of the conviction. Now, what's important about this, okay? Imagine if in America, 43% of people thought that all the cases were invalidated or that they were rigged. Think about that. Think about all the injustice that would happen. It's like Gotham, basically, a corrupt Arkham Asylum where 43% of the people there don't even deserve to be in there. Think about that. So for this to be the case with Trump shows the polarization of politics actually, again, disarming the leverage of the deep state and the swamp, as a lot of people would say. Okay, now this is an interesting hitch to my whole cope, okay? Trump fit to be president now that he's convicted? Question mark. It says actually, in fact, 51% say no, he's not actually qualified. Now, that being said, that's about equidistant from the amount of people, the slight majority that is, that would say that Biden's also unfit. And so this does not map 1-to-1 to what the actual result is in the voting booth, okay? That's one thing to demarcate. Now, another thing to really pronounce is that there's an 8% not sure. Now, that 8% is vital, of course, in any swing election, such as the one we're presented with this year. But let's move on to more factoids. When you look at this, you'll notice right here towards the bottom, should Trump serve prison time for his conviction? 45%, a plurality, say no, he should not, whereas 38% say he should. 17% saying not sure. So you can see how all this changes, okay? Because, of course, if the guy serves prison time, then obviously him being president becomes super complicated. Now, that does not fall in congruence with the prior respondent to the question, which shows the bias in the pollster and also the inadequate information that people have nowadays that are being polled, where they don't even know how this legally works. If you're a first-time offender felon, yeah, odds are if the felony's low enough, like the one Trump got over a paperwork technicality, of course, you're not serving prison time, but we are dealing in crazy times today. And here I'm presenting you with the fact that if Trump were to be put in prison itself, all of a sudden these changes become more sudden, okay? So most people say he should not serve prison time. There's a copacetic amount, and again, a troubling amount of Democrats that would actually want him in an orange jumpsuit. Maybe to, fit his skin color, but the fact is that that would actually help him way more than whatever is happening now is. Just to make it more technical, we're going to break down the backsourcing for one of these polls right now. And as you can see, despite the fact that there's some mixed numbers in regards to whether or not he's qualified to be president, a poll made the day after of this conviction verdict shows that actually Trump is leading the poll by about 1 percentage point over Joe Biden. And what's also important here is that the unsure, as in the I don't know who I'm going to vote for, which is an important 14% swing vote here, you have to notice that about 9% Democrats are polled in here, whereas it's only 5% Republican. What that means is that the Republican base is more solidified behind Trump than the Democratic is behind Biden, despite both of these being groups that are synonymous in size, which is to say, of course, that Trump has a lead in this case, because again, it engenders more support if he's actually seen as a pariah by the other side of the country, whereas a martyr to his own people. Keep in mind with this as well, the independent vote is also somewhat even, and so that kind of shows that that's up for grabs, and that complicates things a hell of a lot more. And more importantly, by the way, Donald Trump plus leaners versus Joe Biden plus leaners, so we're taking out that 14% of undecideds and just putting a metaphorical water gun to their head and saying, hey, vote now. They're actually leading Trump with about 2 percentage points over Biden, over the 1% difference we had when we had the fence sitters actually be quiet. And so now we see that this is actually helping Trump. At least he's in line with where he was, leading in the polls by 1 or 2 percentage points like he was a couple weeks ago prior to this whole conviction hysteria. Also, like I pointed out earlier, there was the poll by CBS, I believe, that showed that if he were to be sentenced in prison, that his support would also go up by a lot, because clearly people know that, okay, you paid hush money to some like conniving lawyer that also screwed you over in some certain way, but then also you didn't table it right in your economics or some accounting error, and therefore what you ought to be to prison. Like obviously an imprisoned Trump would get people's sympathy more than the contrary, and I think it's that clear. Again, we add RFK in here just because we want to be a little bit charitable, and you'll notice that Trump is still winning by 2, even though RFK has 11 percentage points. We have found a kill shot in this video. Like and subscribe if you actually think this is a kill shot for Joe Biden in 2024 politically, because when you look at it, you see that according to this first column, by the way, it'll say that was this thing fair and unbiased? It's 49% saying that it was legit and kosher. Now, to this question, politically motivated, 51%, the majority, out of over 1,000 people sampled, say that it was biased. Now, what's important about this, of course, is that when you look at the second question, it really clarifies these people's positions, okay? So again, they had a confirmation bias. A lot of people do. Obviously, it's a partisan election. But this sort of like nuanced sort of question, in fact, is really exemplary of what the real motivating reasons are for the people that are voting in this election. So let's get right to the bottom of it. Do you think Donald Trump's trials in heavy Democratic jurisdictions like New York City or Atlanta, Georgia, should be moved to a new location by the justice system or to avoid real or perceived bias? Or is it possible to have unbiased juries and an unbiased legal process in these heavily Democratic jurisdictions? Of the people that said that they should be moved to another place, another jurisdiction, because they're super Democratic, 54% of people agree with that notion. So mind you, 2% of people on net think that the thing in and of itself was biased. 8% say that actually having these in such deep blue places where the juries are obviously going to be super leftist is biased. So again, 8% compared to 2%. So you reword basically the same premise, and all of a sudden it's a 4x difference in the margin of victory for Donald Trump, which shows that as time goes on, as the American electorate metabolizes the seriousness of these charges, and how BS the premise for these are, really, and the stretch therein, it'll become more obvious and in a way more opaque for the Democrats to obfuscate from the fact that these biases are going to bite them in the arse with independent voters. Now, you might burst a blood vessel if you stare into these numbers as much as I have, but I've surmised that, in fact, when you aggregate all these columns together, you'll notice that the independents are not really paying close attention to the question at hand, which is to say that how close attention are you paying to these criminal trials for Donald Trump and the 34 criminal convictions? Okay, now the the plurality of independents are actually not paying super close attention as compared to the Democrats or the Republicans from my reading comprehension skills. Okay, now I am Mexican, so maybe I got this wrong, but it seems like if independents are not paying close attention, then it's more likely that they don't have a strong opinion. Now, while that might seem like, well, that's bad for Trump because it's an injustice that people aren't paying attention to in the middle, these swing voters probably do care more about the economy, immigration, the salinity of Joe Biden. And so those issues are actually more of a winning factor for Donald Trump than is however injustice might be perceived in this case. And so this is actually a really good thing for him. So as I was saying before, of no matter what you think of Donald Trump, whether or not you support him or don't, is he mostly guilty of the crimes he's been convicted of by the state of New York? And as you can see, 57% of people say he's guilty, more or less. While that also goes against the prior polls, it actually makes sense where there is a fraction of the country, namely 19% of Republicans, that think, you know what, yeah, Trump is guilty. He did sleep with Stormy Daniels or whatever, and he might have covered it up. But like, do I really care? And also, is he like being misjudged and over prosecuted? That can also be true. And so it shows that despite the facts being against Trump, insofar as obviously like he might have done something 18 years ago that really nobody cares about, it's evident that a lot of people are able to divorce that fact and are able to actually sustain a support for him despite however guilty he might have been in theory, which is actually a good sign for him. It's kind of emblematic of the whole nomenclature of the Teflon Don phenomena, to be honest. Another extremely vital note of information for you guys today. Okay, so if Donald Trump is scheduled to be sentenced in July and faces up to 4 years of imprisonment, but could also receive a lesser punishment, which of the following should Donald Trump receive as a punishment? And so you have a whole list of different columns, and you also have partisan distributed identifying factors. But if you look at it, when you cut it down the middle, this is what the majority of Americans are okay with. So the majority of Americans from both parties, including independents, think that Donald Trump should be released either to probation, home confinement, or less than. So if Trump were to actually be put into prison, for example, only 40% of the country would actually be okay with that. So that would mean that about 3/5 of Americans, including Democrats, including independents, would be against a Trump prison sentence for this pittance of a crime. What that means is that actually if they imprison Trump, it would actually make Trump look better relationally because it's an overcorrection to say the least by the Democrats. And so when it comes to the martyr clause, I would say now as a new tokened phrase, I will say that this is definitely indicative that people do see this thing as over prosecution on the basis of, again, Donald Trump not doing something that bad. Now, the smoking gun to wrap up this video is going to be okay, so does the verdict make you more or less likely to vote for Donald Trump in November, or does the verdict have no impact on the vote? Now, about 30% of people say that they're more likely to vote for Trump after this conviction, whereas 27% say that they're less likely to vote for Trump, whereas 44%, aka the plurality, say that it has no impact. Why is this important? Why is this important? So you can see that overall on the net, this helps Trump out by 3%, which is huge in a close election, but also that the majority doesn't even care. Now, that might be a bad thing for Republicans if you have no brain cells, but to be honest, if you elaborate that thought, you'll notice right off the bat that the people that are not impacted by the conviction are also those same people that were voting for Trump anyway by the majority of the polls as of recently, which is to say that they're not going to vote on the conviction, but they will vote on inflation, they'll vote on the debt, they're going to vote on the lack of healthcare progression, a lack of crime watch. Okay, so a myriad of different issues that the Republicans are winning on, the majority in, are going to be tested for Donald Trump out of these sampled Republican voters, Democrats, independents. And so you can see how not only does this help Trump by 3% overall, but the of the remainder majority, they also are going to be voting on the merits that help Donald Trump more or less. So we more or less scientifically deduce that Trump will probably benefit a little bit from this conviction, not enough to flip certain states from 2016, but I do think that he will solidify further red states. And so I think the election map comes down to this, just to save you guys some time. Maybe Nebraska second will stay a pungent blue, but there it is, 312 electoral votes to Biden's 226. We'll see what changes, and I'll see y'all on the next one. Adios.